So once again, welcome to week 10, the final week. We've covered all 11 chapters, and now we'll be doing the course review as part of tonight's class. So a couple things as we talk about as far as before we go into the specific questions here. So on the first thing, before we go into the actual materials, is test-taking strategy. Those that haven't taken a test in a while, especially a computer-based exam, it can be a little daunting. So just as kind of more background, and I think originally I said in the beginning, I think 85 questions. It's actually 75 question exam, and you have 2 hours to complete the exam. The passing score is 70% or higher. So what does that mean? You can miss 22 questions and still pass the exam. Now, the reason why I raise that is that from a test-taking strategy, what I try to do is answer all the questions, go through and answer everything I know, and then you kind of count and get an idea of how you're doing on the exam. And so, if you start seeing, okay, if you only have 10 or 15 where you're going, wow, I don't know any of these at all, and then you have a couple that are questionable, the whole point of what we're trying to do is to pass the test. So even if you only passed by one, you passed. Nothing else gets reported. It basically says P for pass on there, or that you didn't pass the exam. So if you think about the number of questions, you have about 75 seconds for each question. Some will take a little bit less time, and some, some math will take a little bit more time to do that. You're going to have about 53 questions that I would call that are more simple. They're or core questions. Asking more. Which one of these is part of the COPE COPE as far as the construction, occupancy, protection, and external environment type thing. It might ask something like that. The 22 are applied questions. So what that means is they're going to have they're scenario based. They're going to be saying they're going to give you a little bit of background information and say here's all these different things, and then you're going to have about 3 or 4 questions off of each one of those applied questions. Now they don't build off of each other. So if you whatever answer you gave them one, doesn't necessarily won't impact the next question. And what you're also going to find is, especially on the math questions or those that deal with some of the any type of math type of issues or things like that, that there's going to be a lot of red herring, some information that kind of looks like it's meaningful, but it's really not. And so it's also really important, and this is the next part, read each question very carefully. A lot of times what I find people do is that they rush through and they misunderstood the question and they miss it because it says which all of these apply to the situation except for, and so again you got to be read the question, and I think I'd say down below, don't overanalyze. Usually your first gut reaction is most likely the correct one. And what you'll also find is that there's going to be some answers that, just like with any other thing, there might be probably 5 answers, and 3 of them will be, there's no way, that those aren't the answers, and 2 are pretty close, and now you got a 50-50 shot at getting some of those questions. So as far as, again, test-taking strategy, answer the questions Go through. What I recommend is you go all the way through as much as you can through the exam, and mark the questions that you're not 100% sure. So background on the computer-based exam, what's going to happen is when you enter the room, if it's a paramedics testing center, which most people probably go to, it is fairly strict security. They'll actually have everything out of your pockets, and everything needs to go into a locker, no phones or anything else that can be in there. They will provide you, depending on the center, typically it's either you'll get a pencil and a couple sheets of paper, and you have to return the pieces of paper at the end, or they'll give you a whiteboard, a little mini whiteboard, and a marker to be able to kind of scratch notes out. So one of the other things that I recommend as you go in is that if you're concerned about equations or what does COPE stand for, or kind of those type of things, to do a brain dump. So as soon as you get in, they say, okay, you're ready to get started. Just start writing stuff on the whiteboard. Put down the things that you really feel you need to remember that'll help you, And so that will basically, that can be your little notepad, because obviously you can't bring any notes in there, but whatever's in your brain, you bring in your brain, you can put on that whiteboard. Do that. They will do, as part of when you go in, a review of how to use the computer-based. It's like a little tutorial. So total time, I think you have a half hour. You can do the tutorial, and then you also have total amount is 2 hours to take the exam. And so with that tutorial time, it'll walk through of how to mark questions, how to go back, how to operate within the system. And if you haven't done the computer-based exam, I do recommend that you kind of just walk through. It'll also indicate that there's like little appendixes, or if you're taking 54, how to get the formulas, but there'll be other tables that you can access as part of that. So you're going to have one screen, so it's kind of how you manipulate, learning how to operate within the computer-based environment. On there, you'll be able to answer all the questions. You'll be able to mark, there'll be little things you can say, okay, I want to mark the question to review later. And then at the end, at some point, you can review and say, let's see all the questions. And it'll have all the questions listed. It'll say whether it was answered. It'll say A, answered, M for marked, or marked and unanswered. So the idea is, do you want to see just want to review all the questions you haven't answered yet? You'll see those. Or you can mark all the ones that you have marked. And so I really recommend, as you go through, if you know 100% you got that one, don't mark it. And if it's those that you've answered and you're just, you're kind of going through, you're kind of sure, but you want to review later, again, mark that one and go through. Again, eliminate wrong answers, 50-50 chance. You want to answer every single question. So if you get crunched in time and, you kind of go through and you only have 5 minutes left, there'll be a little timer on there saying how much time you have left on there as well. And if you go, okay, I'm not going to be able to do it, but I know I need to, if nothing else, I'll crapshoot, I'll try to answer these questions. You'll just want to go through and look, tap the thing, and it'll say review all unanswered, and just start marking them and go through, and at least you've answered every question. As I've said before, your first choice is usually the correct answer. Don't overanalyze the questions. Sometimes, and there'll be some cues on there what looks like might be the right answer, but you've got to read the answers really carefully too, because it might say, a loss prevention, loss reduction versus loss prevention techniques or something like that. And, again, there's just a little change in words that might just have a little different meaning, and so you want to make sure you read those fairly carefully as well. As I said at the beginning, how you want to study, what I recommend, study each chapter by, read the direct your learning, so the objectives at the beginning of the chapter. Make flashcards of those topics that ask you to list things. So anything in there that's in a list form, the COPE, when it says there's 5 of these things or 4 of these things are essential elements. But anything that's typically in a list that's an element of another thing, those are the types of things that you want to probably try to memorize, because and we'll talk, and you'll see that as we go through. What I try to do is make some of those lists for you in this review. Read the chapter summary. Again, if it's repeated there, it's most likely important enough for the test. And review those elements you're not familiar. And, the big thing is always tell people is understand the why. Why is this important? Why would they want you to know this? Make flashcards of keywords or phrases. Think big picture. And actually, I need to scratch off understand chapter 6. That was from 54. I forgot to take that off. So when I talk about the big picture, part of the big picture is they're not expecting you to know all the specific details. They're asking, if you're a risk manager, what would be the important things to consider? If you're doing a risk assessment or risk control, maybe it's an environmental type of issue. As a risk manager, you should know what RCRA is. You should know why it's important. What are some of that I could be held accountable for cradle to grave? Some of those, it's the big picture key concepts. They're not going to be so worried about what was the date that this was implemented and what specific provision within RCRA would require. You're typically not going to see questions like that. They want to be able to make sure as a risk manager that you have enough knowledge to ask the right questions if you were put in a position and you took over, and if you've got a new job and you have some of these elements, risk exposures, would you be able to ask the right questions? And that's really what 55 is trying to do. It's trying to make sure that you can ask the right questions and to be able to go through those. Applied questions, so what you're going to see is a lot of times when we talk about the core questions, they'll be dealing with a specific area. But when you get to the applied questions, again, the scenario-based, it's probably going to be taking elements from different chapters. There's going to be things dealing with environmental, with fleet, with a couple different risk exposures. And so the idea is, okay, so they're going to say you're, as part of the operations, you have a fleet of vehicles, of big rig trucks, and they sometimes carry hazardous materials and things like that. And so there's going to be questions probably dealing with environmental risk. There's going to be questions dealing with fleet risk. So it's going to be talking about, well, what are the type of routes, or what are the considerations you'd want to have? Because if you think about fleet risk, it talks about cargo and, you know, driver selected, and then it's also going to deal with federal motor vehicle carrier, you know, so you're going to have something on there. You do want to try to memorize the formulas in some cases. I believe that they do give some formulas, and this one's not, 54 is much bigger on formulas. We really didn't have any that were really part of 55 as much. And the important part, you can fail an entire chapter of questions and still pass the exam. Okay, so if there's a chapter where, you know, people all get really stressed on the math, or like in 54, you know, you have to think about each chapter with 11, 75. You're probably going to maybe have on average about 5 or 6 questions, you know, per chapter, maybe 7 at the most. It used to be 15 chapters, so it was spread out a little bit more. So you're probably going to see more questions on there. But it's possible, you know, if you really don't get a concept, focus on the other areas. And again, the idea is to pass the exam and then hopefully refresh on that. So this is actually a great report that's from 54. This is the type of report that you'll see at the end once you take your exam. So this is what's sent out after the fact. So after you take your exam, you know, say submit, you'll instantaneously say you either be in a really good mood or you'll not be in a good mood based upon whether you pass or fail. It'll basically say that, you know, you'll know within seconds of hitting submit. Within a couple days, you're going to get a report that looks something like this. And you'll see at the bottom it says, you know, it has chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 11. And then on the exam score overall, so this one person scored about 89, somewhere around the 80 to 89% range. And you can see, well, Chapter 6 wasn't so hot and Chapter 10 wasn't so hot. So the fact that this person basically got 50% or less of the questions, or only 50% of the questions right in Chapter 6 and 10, but they still passed with an 80%, you know, it did fairly well. And typically, again, you're going to see some different questions there. So, you know, again, the reason why I want to show this is that, you know, I've seen people that, you know, basically almost have nothing passing in a certain area on a chapter, and yet they still will pass the exam. So, with that, is there any questions regarding the exam kind of protocol before we go into more of the details? So we do have a hand up here, and it looks like a couple questions. So, Catherine, I'm going to go ahead. So the question you have is, what is the time frame for taking the test? Does it have a deadline of when it has to be taken after the class? So as far as test taking, what you have when you go to the institutes, you're going to see that, you know, if you click on 55, it's going to say window. You have to take the exam. And it'll say window of, I think this one is September 15th. So the next window will begin September 16th through, I think, near December. So it's usually a 3-month window. You can take the exam anytime. There's no, you know, saying after the class. There's nothing saying you have to take it immediately. You can take it 6 months from now. You can take it a year from now. But the testing window, the idea is that once you select within the window, you have to take it within that 3-month time window. Once you're in that window, if you're taking it at Paramedics Testing Center, they'll give you, once you register, they'll give you a code. You call Paramedics, and you give them that code, and you set a date. Once you set that date, if you change it, then you get charged by Paramedics for changing the date. If you don't set a date, and maybe you need to take it at another time, for whatever reason you want to take it in the next testing window, there'll be a cancellation fee, but they'll give you some credit for taking another period of time. If you're taking it, for those that are UC employees that are going to take it, we are a testing center at Office of the President. that if you're here, you can take it anytime within that window. There's no charge fee because you set the date with me, and then we will go ahead and set that time up. So, and the main reason for the testing windows is that just like they changed the material back in October 2012, they want to make sure if there's any changes to the textbook that you're taking the exam with the right textbook that was done. And so that's the main reason. The other reason is if you decide to schedule your test later in the testing period, they'd like to charge you more money. So the earlier that you schedule, at least in there, that's going to be better off time there. So you'll see on there that if you did early bird kind of registration for the test, it's I think $180. If you decide to take it later, just it's going to be like $225. So they charge a little bit more for taking the test later. All right. So let's go ahead and go into Chapter 1. So the way we're going to go through this tonight is kind of going over key concepts. There's essentially I've done one of these for each chapter, and the things you want to study. The things in red, I can pretty much guarantee you will have questions on, and those are probably the areas that you want to spend a little more time studying, or make sure you understand those key concepts, especially at the 50,000-foot level. So, of course, the first chapter, Introduction of Risk Assessment and Treatment. To a certain extent, it was a review of what was in 54. So those that had already taken 54, it looked pretty familiar to what you've probably seen. As far as risk assessment process, again, 50,000-foot level, why risk assessments are, what are the different approaches, top-down, bottom-up type of approaches, risk identification techniques, and the risk analysis. Again, 50,000-foot level, those type of things you just want to review. Look at the review notes. That'll certainly help. Know the different identification analysis techniques and what techniques are appropriate for the various situations. So, we'll go into, obviously, some detail there. Risk treatment process and techniques. Avoidance, those type of things we've talked, and we'll talk, of course, this is more the introduction. We go into more details. We go through the later chapters. The accident causation theories and details. The domino theory, energy transfer, technique of operations are pretty the three big ones. You're going to find questions that deal with what does energy transfer theory have to deal with? It's really the kinetic energy. It's it's the idea of cars hitting each other. It's it's dealing with things in motion essentially. Whereas the domino theory, if you remember that, if you take out one domino out of the process, essentially you can prevent the injury. On the domino theory, the main domino is unsafe acts. If you can remove the unsafe act, therefore you're not going to have an injury, and that's the key concept. And so you're going to have some type of question that's going to say, which one of these theories is that unsafe act is the primary cause of injuries? Okay, and they're going to give you domino theory, energy transfer, torque, those type of things. And so you have to know at least those key concepts. Why is the domino theory important? Because it deals with that. Energy theory, transfer, deals with the one part. Technique of operations review. If you remember on that, the main discussion there is it's about management. As management is one of the key concepts that, by management oversight, if they manage the processes, those type of things, you're going to be able to prevent injuries and accidents. So that's where the different theories come into play. You have to understand what's the big picture element of each one of those. No system safety in the life cycle issues. And with life cycle, we talk about that in fleet safety as well. But on the system safety, they're going to go into that element. Loss control techniques. And this is really going to be true throughout the whole chapter. Is avoidance, loss prevention, loss reduction, separation, duplication, diversification. That's a key concept that's really, when you think about it, from how do you avoid workers' comp claims or human capital issues? How do you avoid general liability? You have to think of those. How do you prevent a fire? Well, we're not going to do things that are related, the potential for fire. We're going to put sprinklers in, or other elements. That'll be more. Sprinklers would be loss reduction. Separation, duplication, diversification, that deals with personnel, that you're going to have people that can, cross-train. Equipment-wise, you're going to have some of those issues. So again, the concept of what those loss control techniques are and how they can be applied to all the different loss exposures. That's really the 50,000-foot level they're really trying to look for. So, and then also when we talk, this is from, they use the same chart. This was from 54. It's also in 55. I think it's important to understand as we go through the different elements of how do you control the hazard, operational, strategic, and financial risk aspects of it. So, and what things fall under operational: people risk, IT, management oversight. If you look on hazard risk, that's property, legal, personnel. I mean, you kind of get an idea of what's pure risk versus speculative risk. And so this is a good chart to also remember as part of the process. Chapter 2, and it's kind of amazing that we went through all these, it seems like so long ago, but it really wasn't. It was only, 9 weeks ago probably, right? Nature of root cause analysis and steps. So the thing I highlighted here is that when we talk about root cause analysis, and we're going to talk about some of the different approaches, the key elements are the steps. And that's where the focus will be on when on this chapters. You need to have data collection to be able to have good data. That's going to be the key first step. Causal factors charting, risk mapping, those type of things. Identifying the root cause and the recommendation determination. So the main elements, again, on this chapter, this is where you're going to most likely see types of questions, is dealing with why is root cause analysis important, and what are the steps in doing root cause. You are definitely going to see a question dealing with FMEA, failure mode effects analysis, and FTA, fault tree analysis, and best uses of those approaches. Even though there's other things that are mentioned, these are really the big ones. There's typically a question that's going to be related to FTA. The idea is, how are they used, or which one would describe a method? So there's probably going to be a scenario saying that they looked at the components and found these type of problems that led to these things. They're able to identify. Well, if you're talking about components and you're looking at how it affects the entire system, well, that's going to be failure modes and effect analysis. Okay, because it looks at failures of the components. It looks at the specific kind of pieces and says, what's the effect on the larger system? Okay, we talked about a car. Okay, if we have a failure of the transmission, the car, 1 gear goes out. Well, it might affect. We can still drive it, but not as efficiently. If the head gasket blows, okay, we're probably not driving it. If there's certain elements that are just going to be key to that. The FTA is deductive, which means moving from general to specific, saying the idea of, if I have an injury, of it's going to say, okay, use a space shuttle. What could cause a space shuttle to explode? And you kind of go, well, it could be a leaky seal. You can kind of go through, and then you start going from what's the worst thing that could happen specifically, or let's use a car. What would cause a car not to run anymore? No fuel. Head gasket blown. You can kind of go through the engine failure. You can go through these different things, and so you're going from a general thing, and you keep on going backwards to something that's more specific. So you're going to have some type of question that's going to deal with something like that, and where would be the most effective use to use that type of method to do a root cause from that process. Chapter 3, we dealt with business continuity management. On this one, obviously there's going to be questions from every chapter, but this is probably one that, as far as what area you want to focus on, it's a little harder to determine, because it's, again, it aligns when we think about enterprise risk management, the idea of business continuity. It's a very general concept. We want to keep our operations going. And so the main issue, I'd say, is how risk management and business continuity are similarly aligned. That it's really the same process that we're using, and there will probably be some questions related to that. The business continuity standards, that's dealing with NFPA 1600 and some of the ISO standards and some other things that deal with. I wouldn't expect really too many questions on there. There might be, but it's just important to know that there are standards for organizations to measure themselves with. In some cases, depending on the type of business, they may be required to have some type of to meet those standards, to be able to make sure that there are security of operations if something was to go wrong, that they have backups, things like that. I'd probably say if you are going to see some more questions, it's going to be, explain how risk mitigation is achieved through business continuity planning. So the business impact analysis, the risk assessment, and the development of the continuity plan. That's where you're probably going to see most of the questions, is something along those lines. Stages of strategic redeployment planning, which is basically, how do we get back up and running? It's interesting, they kind of use, some lingo. Strategic redeployment planning. It's make sure you have the resources, you have the continuity plans, you have the proper people trained, all those things. Supply chain issues that could threaten an organization at the 50,000-foot level. If any, actually, this is probably the area that I also say you're going to have questions of. If you think about if your supply chain had a problems, if you're, where you're getting your core supplies, that's part of the business continuity. If you can't get supplies because of bottlenecks, those type of things, that's where the questions are going to come from on there. And then the other areas are going to be the crisis communication and planning. That having effective crisis communication, how do you communicate to internal clients, external clients, to employees, that we're still in operation, we're going to survive through this, but that crisis communication planning should occur prior to a catastrophe occurring. And I think that's probably the key point, is a lot of these things, I hope, after taking, doing this, a lot of this is just common sense. It's good business practices. And so it's really applying what would be good business practices, understanding some of those elements of, hey, if I'm a risk manager and I need to advise the president or someone else, what would I be recommending if I saw this was a core thing that was going to disable? If we can't operate, if our core function is we're a grocery store, well, one of the ways we make money is there's got to be product on the shelf. Well, if I can't deliver the product, that's a core area that I need to have a business continuity plan. If I lost access, whether it be roads to be able to deliver that product, my warehouse goes down, those are the types of things that I would need to consider as part of that. If I lose one store, that's okay. But if I lose a warehouse that supplies to all those stores, now all my stores are affected. And so that's the idea of, again, kind of think the big picture of how does it impact the entire organization. I can suffer a loss in one place by name, what's going to disable the organization where I can't operate at all, and it affects the income of the organization. So physical property risk. There's a lot of things on here. This was probably the longest chapter I think we had, was probably 40-plus pages. The categories of physical property, I think, that's easy. Real property deals with buildings and tangible personal property. I think most people recognize that. The areas that we talked about on here were the sources of risk, natural sources, Mother Nature, wind, earthquake, flood, fire, lightning would be those natural sources. And to think, okay, and again, dealing with physical property, how would that affect the building? How does that affect the structure on there? Then there's also the human sources, which would be the riots, vandalism, vehicles, crime. How do you plan for those type of things that might be more human source related? Again, we're talking about real property. In the next chapter, we talked about intellectual property. So the idea is also, if we had a fire, damage to accounts receivable paperwork, or data. In some cases, there's that discussion of whether that's tangible personal property, or securities, money, those type of things can be, or equipment. It's not just buildings, equipment. If that gets damaged, what effect would that have? The big thing here, because on each one of these, if you remember, we went through pre and post loss activities that you take. So if you're preparing for an earthquake, what's the pre-loss activities you're going to take? Well, you're going to hopefully have retrofitting for your structure. You're going to, there's going to be certain things you're going to put in place to ensure that if there's an earthquake, from a pre-loss standpoint, to minimize the effects or mitigate some of the effects of an earthquake. And then you're going to have post-loss activities. So after the building, you're going to make sure structural engineers, you're going to make sure other types of things are put in place. Flood, fire, again, fire pre-loss activity, sprinkler building. Maybe the pre-loss activities make sure that your building, when you decide to build it's not in an area that's prone to more wildfires, things like that. And post-loss, again, is how quickly you can get up and running. Understand COPE and elements under each. So remember, COPE is construction, occupancy, protection, and external environment. So the construction, again, there's a lot of discussion of joint masonry and all those things. You're going to need to know the difference of the different building types. Wood construction and some of those. So you're going to have questions on those. Occupancy, you're going to have scenario questions regarding concerns with different types of occupancy. So you're going to have something that deals with that you're operating a whatever type of facility, a theater or a mall. And so what are the concerns you might have as a risk manager, concerns about being able to evacuate people or something like that, or a conference room. Again, all the things, there's reasons why there's space limits where they're required to post occupancy levels. It's because how can they safely get people out of a building? And that's been determined partly by the fire marshal based upon the square footage and how they can get people out safely in those type of structures. The protection element deals with the fire protection aspects, the sprinklers, what kind of fire protection is there, and then the external environment is where it's built. What type of is it near areas where it's more likely to be damaged by those various elements that we described before. So COPE is definitely something you're going to find on there, and you'll probably, at least in the past, they had more questions on the fire protection, specifically on the masonry, the construction type, and trying to think of the firewalls, just the different ways you can, how it's constructed can certainly, or protected with these different elements will be part of that. The fire protection systems, how they reduce likelihood and consequence of fire, and it kind of goes through the different types. You're probably not going to see as many questions on that, but it's just understanding, it's important to have these systems in place to have monitored. Know how human characteristics, building occupancy, and life safety code, exits, changes risk exposure in the event of a fire. What I mean, it kind of goes back to what we talked about. The idea is if you have a daycare center, or the precautions because you have young children, that's a different type of occupancy. That means you have to have more people be able to monitor. They can't take care of themselves. What type of the human characteristics. So that goes to the human characteristics. So they need help to be able to get out. The building occupancy issue is, okay, well, if we have young children and it's a theater, if we have young children and it's a daycare, how many people, how occupied, what type of material is being stored in the building? Those are things that can be, more flammable. Or if we're in a warehouse environment, the building occupancy is going to, like I said, have more probably flammable material. Human characteristics, we're not going to have as many people probably in there, but we're going to have forklifts and we're going to have other things. And then the life safety code issue is, okay, are we more likely to have blocked exits in certain types of environments? The number of exits. So life safety code deals with, if you look at that chapter, the one thing, it's all about exits, about lighting. How do people know to get out of those various areas? It does talk about understanding valuing physical property. And the important thing there is big picture. Why is one method better than the other? Maybe? So replacement cost versus market value. Why would you use, why would be more advantageous? Again, you don't know how the specific of the formulas work. They're not going to get that detailed. What their understanding is, replacement values it. Was it the value of the home of when it was built? Is it the market value? All those type of things kind of go. And then the last on there is the legal interest in property. Typically, what I've always seen in the past where people get questions is the one that people sometimes don't understand is the whole bailment concept. Okay, when we talked about bailment before, legal, when you go into a parking garage, okay, it says this does not create a bailment, okay. But if bailment is created when you take your car to your car fixed and it stays overnight, okay, there's bailment. They agree to take it. If something happens, they're going to have to replace the vehicle. Why it's in their possession, they're responsible for that. So understanding the bailie's interest in that. I talked about landlords and stuff, but most likely if you're going to see a question, it's going to be on the bailment because that's one of those unique situations that's important for a risk manager to know and understand. Chapter 5, a lot of red. Okay, there's a lot of things I think they're more likely to see a question on here. One, because it's becoming more and more prevalent, so a lot of intellectual property and reputational risk area. Understand interplay between the different types of intellectual property. So on chapter, in the chapter, it's 5.5 is the page. That's where actually there's a little chart in there that talks about, how patents and trade secrets, what's the interplay between those? When does if it's a trade secret, maybe eventually it becomes a patent. What's the advantage, because once people know, example, so a trade secret, as long as it's secret, it's protected and you do your due diligence to protect it. The KFC's recipe, no one knows the recipe. No one knows Coca-Cola's recipe. But once something is patented, it now becomes, there's a certain patent requirement. At some point, that patent expires, and now everyone else can replicate that recipe. So what's the advantage is understanding why one would want to keep a trade secret rather than having something patented. So that's really where you're going to see questions like that most likely. Understand who owns copyright and what rules are when something can be copyrighted and how to protect it. So each one of the chapters, it goes through, it talks about copyrights and says, what the rules are, what can you do to protect it. It talks about patent, talks about trademark, all those. For the most part, the protections are very similar, providing notice, all those. So you want to know what those notice requirements are, but most likely if you're going to get a question, it's more likely going to be on the copyright area, just because that's more common infringement than anything else, and it really includes all those different elements that are part of it. What are the qualities of a trademark? That's on page 5.12. Unique, image, all those type of things. Remember, talked about some of those. I already talked about different types of patents and interplay between trade secrets. What the different types of, there can be design patents, all those, that's where it talked about, there's the different types of patents were discussed in that chapter. Reputation risk. And this is something that's new. This wasn't in the textbook before. So I'd expect definitely a question is how reputation can affect the value of an organization. And because there's really no dollar amount, how do you say what that's worth? And so, but what I talked about there is that, reputation can really affect 75% of the organization's assets, because if something bad happens, people may not want to shop at that particular thing. They will buy the products. And what are the sources of reputational risk? They're going to be part of that bad press, those things. And then discussion of implementation of a plan to preserve reputation, which kind of goes back into the crisis management thing. How do you communicate? And I think really the thing here is if you just think about BP as an example of how not having a plan can damage reputation even more. If we talked about that, the CEO went on a yacht and wasn't just kind of out of touch and basically made the situation a whole heck of a lot worse as being really seen as uncaring. So I think, if you kind of look at it from the big picture, you think of those other examples, that's what's going to help you be able to answer questions related to that, because it's not going to get too specific on what some of those elements are. Chapter 6, legal and regulatory risk. So typically, and this is what you've seen starting once we start this chapter, talk about torts and the different types of torts. Even though it talks about contractual and statutory other areas of legal and regulatory risk, the main focus you're going to find is everyone's sue happy. And so torts are a major element, and negligence, intentional torts, and strict liability. To understand that strict liability means it doesn't really matter whether negligent, the fact that it happened, you can be sued. And then negligence torts, someone tripped and fell, they can claim negligence because you didn't, and it goes back to the whole duty of care type of issues and understand what those, or what a reasonable person should have done in a similar situation. The reason why this is also important, because on environmental, we talked about torts. On the other elements, we talked about torts with employment practices and management. So the idea of torts and these statutory things, they keep on going through, just like avoidance, loss prevention, loss reduction, separation. Those are the common themes that really go through every type of exposure. So that's why it's important to know those. What is a contract? So what are the elements, essentially? How do you make it enforceable? There's going to be some questions most likely on a contract and what things you need to make sure to look at within there. And it's within there, there's going to be discussion of probably hold harmless, indemnity language, those type of things. So so that goes more to the risk transfer aspect, but there'll be something there. Focus on modifying event likelihood and consequence can help treat legal and regulatory risk. And that I'm trying to remember, since when I was writing this, make sure you're following the laws, and by making sure the reasonable care issues, those are the type of things what it's talking about to help reduce some of the consequences there. The prominent legal systems. This is a new section. So I don't know what type of questions really will be on there, but I would expect that there's not going to be too anything specific, but just kind of know the general elements between the common law and all the different types of systems. Say, okay, well, Russia practiced this from this certain time period to this. That's not going to happen. Okay, it's going to be what are the common practices to have just an understanding, with the idea being that if you're a company and you're going to go into that country and start operating, you should have an understanding of, okay, these are some of the things you might want to consider as part of that. Public international law and private international law, and again, the focus will be the interplay of what is the right thing to do if you operate in multiple countries. Part of the discussion in that chapter was, are you going to go, because you can, child labor laws, okay? Well, you can use child labor in other countries, it's legal. But the reputational impact or the other things, you may not want to do that. And so as a corporation, the idea is, what of implementing really were the best practices across other areas. To another circumstance, if I'm, Walmart or someone, I want to probably try to have the same safety rules. California is more restrictive. Well, do I want to have a different set of operational rules depending on which state I'm in? Probably not. You want to have a standard training program, which also makes it easier to comply, and you're not going to have things fall through the cracks. Understand different types of loss exposure involving below and how to treat the different exposures. So when we talk about premises and operational liability, okay, so we're talking about people slipping and falling, those type of things. People getting hurt on a piece of property. So understanding, what are those exposures and what would you do to help prevent those? Okay, if I own this, okay, so if I'm a city and I have, playgrounds, again, this is more common sense. So I have playgrounds, without even knowing that there's in California law that requires that, certified playground safety inspector is supposed to inspect the playground before it's out there. I'd want to make sure that the playground has safe equipment, right? So the exposure if someone can fall, okay, good ground cover, is you'll probably have maybe inspection, and if it's in a park area, the concern if you're in a larger city, making sure there's not needles and other types of things where the kids can get harmed. So again, you can probably think of these situations and go, okay, yeah, if I was to do this, these would be my concerns. Think common sense stuff. Products and completed operations liability. Again, that's dealing with really quality control issues. So how would you make sure you have quality control? What are the systems you have in place? Auto liability, vehicle accidents, things like that. And then work comp and employer's liability. We're dealing with how do you prevent employees from getting injured? So what's the liability? Well, if you have safety programs, you're going to ergonomics, you're lifting, understanding some of those things. Again, from a common sense approach, you're going to get scenario questions, most likely saying, what would you do in this situation? What would be the best treatment if you had a concern about employees being injured and it's a manufacturing operation? What would be the things you'd want to look at? And as we go through some of the things, like loss history, past, if it's looking at past injuries, that can help guide us to help prevent those in the future. Looks like we do have a question. So the question is, would this chapter cover the recent death at the Philadelphia Zoo where the mom held her 2-year-old up on the fence and he fell in and was killed? Operational liability. So actually that would be a good question. So San Francisco, kind of similar thing, a couple of years, no, San Diego or San Francisco Zoo? The tiger. So basically the issue is that I think the fence was too low, or at least that was the argument, was the fence was too low. So the question kind of goes, what's the standard of care? So within a zoo environment, did it meet kind of the standards for the proper heights? And I think they did raise. I think there was concern about the height of that, so they ended up raising it. So in this case, where the mom held her 2-year-old up on the fence. So from a negligence standpoint, so this goes to the notice requirements. Do not put, do not feed the animals. Do not hang on the fence or something like that. So the question will become, did they have any notification when they entered? Was there anything when they entered the zoo facility that said, again, don't feed, don't put your arms through the fence, things like that, that would give notification. Was it in different languages? Might be the issue as well, depending on that. But the fact, typically, when we talk about falling through, there's also the issue, like with playground equipment. There's actually certain widths of how big the spacing is between, the uprights. So a child's head doesn't get stuck. Well, actually, this goes to the issue of the stadium. We had opening night football. There's two people, San Francisco, someone fell? In Atlanta. So someone fell from the stadium. One was going down the things. So could it be operational liability? Yes. But the idea is, so thinking as a risk manager for the zoo, what would be, you can think of, okay, what would you do to prevent this? Knowing this, if I operate a different zoo, what would be the things I'd want to look at? So I'd be looking at signage, all these different, you're not going to prevent stupidity. You're going to have people do stupid stuff like this. And so, but at least from a risk management standpoint, did we do reasonable precautions? It's reasonable care. That's what we're really looking at when we do it. So, but good question, I think, and that's exactly how you want to start thinking of things when you look at the exam. If you think of these scenarios, you can think through, what would I do if I was the risk manager? Or if I had similar operations, how would I handle those different issues? All right, so Chapter 8.
Just by the way, you did skip over 7.
Oh, I did? Oops.
There's no slide for it.
Oops. Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to cover. I'll send out another slide on that. My apologies. I think I did is I did it, and then in the process somehow deleted it. So I know I did it. So Chapter 8, human resource risk. Factors that affect human resource potential. So the idea when we talk about human resources, we're talking about people. So one of the factors that affect human resource potential as an organization, that's, well, do we have a good workforce? So health, education, the general population. You're going to have the question that's going to deal with something that if I'm looking at relocating to, the organization's looking to create a new facility and such, what would be some of the considerations I'd want to consider? You'll have some different things. And health, education, and general population is one of those things to make sure that, do they have good schools, those type of things. That'll be part of the likely question. Selection procedures, preservation of employee productivity, productive capabilities, so not getting injured. So it's having a safety program, right? Rehab of injured or ill employees. How do we get them back? That's a return to work program. Retention of productive employees. That's making, resignation or retirement. When we talk resignation, the big concern is people going to the competitor. And they could leave us because when we talk about retention, what makes people leave? Money, benefits, better living environment, a better location. So there's different things. So again, big picture, if you think about why people leave, come to an organization, how do we keep them? So when we talk about human resource potential, we're talking again about the big picture of those elements. Focus on prevention efforts to reduce work-related injuries and resignation of key employees, so that's going to be an element. On the work-related violence, focus on operations that are more likely to have robbery issues and measures to protect employees. So we can think about this, okay? Think about our daily lives. When we go to a bank in Oakland, this chair, they have a security guard out front. Sometimes they have people that buzz. They've got cameras all over the place. They've got, the window. I mean, they have all these things if you think about. If I go to, in Oakland, I go to a bank, then I go to where I live in, a small town in Cameron Park and rescue area. There's no security guard. Yeah, they probably still have cameras, but there's no, windows. Actually, I have to admit, we have a Subway, right down, Subway sandwich place right down the street. And one day I went in, and they have a bullet, the window now separating between the customer. And it's part of the concern is when you do that, it's just so often I don't go there anymore because it's like, why? It's obviously they've been robbed and they decided to do that, but it made it so much that there truly is a barrier now between that maybe I don't want to go here because this is an issue of me going down. So it can also turn off people when you do that. So the process of protecting employees may also make you lose customers as well. But think, so the idea is, again, one, you're going to get questions about work-related violence, how to prevent it. Think about those operations where you've been in and how other organizations would most likely, do that. And again, convenience stores and banks, those are good examples. Most likely you're going to have some questions on kidnap and ransom protection measures if you're operating, probably not too much, but you'll probably have a question dealing with that, and it's going to be somewhat of a general question most likely. No methods to help assess an exposure. This is the same methods for other things. So the same list we've seen before: questionnaires, loss histories, other records or documents, flow charts, personal inspections, and expertise within and beyond the organization. No risk control techniques. Again, same as the other exposures: avoidance, loss prevention, loss reduction, separation, duplication. Okay, because those things are going to apply, throughout. As a risk manager, this is what you do. You're always going to be looking at loss histories, flow charts. This is what's going to help you determine where the risks are, and then also say, oh, these are the type of injuries, so here's the things we need to put in place. And then the techniques you're going to use to do that, we're going to say, we're not going to do window washing anymore. Too risky. Okay? We don't want people falling. Or what are the loss prevention techniques? Provide training, loss prevention, provide slipper-resistant shoes, loss reduction, make sure we have sprinklers in the building, things like that will be part of that. Chapter 9, environmental risk. So obviously this is only from just a couple weeks ago, so this will be relatively fresh. Understand how environmental liability can cost an organization. Again, torts, contract, statutory law. And again, there's that focus on this tortsing it. The idea that, in many cases, that environmental issues are going to be more costly than any others in many ways, and understand how the statutes are really driving the torts, because people can sue because you didn't follow the EPA regs, the air resource regs, those type of things. And understand that I put in here, in general, how environmental loss exposures may cause property, personnel, and net income losses. Again, the idea that, if you have a leak or something of product, it can damage equipment, devalue the property, possibly. The personnel can be injured because of the type of chemicals being used, again, from environmental. And obviously, if people, because, environmental impact, BP, net income, again, you can look at BP in many ways with the whole environmental, but that because of that explosion, you lost people, they lost property, and they lost money through that whole thing. Know the table on environmental laws. That's on page 911. And so it goes through, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, but the ones I'd focus on, CERCLA and RCRA. And understand, one's Superfund, one's, cradle to grave, because those are really the key that everyone has to deal with. And there'll be questions about suppliers. What things would you want to look at if you're selecting a company that's going to have to haul materials? What are the concerns you might have with that? No process to identify loss exposures and challenges in identifying those loss exposures. And again, the book talked about focus on materials, routes, and target populations as process. So what are the materials we have? What are most likely the routes or pathways that they're going to travel to do damage to the environment, and who's going to be affected? Those are the key concepts through this chapter. And as long as you focus on, that's, again, it's in red. You're going to have some type of question, whether it be scenario-based, that's going to deal with this type of area. Risk assessment factor characteristics. So the risk assessment factors, so ones can be the characteristics and behavior of the material, the pathways analysis. So this kind of goes back to some of the things we talked about. The populations at risk, management practices, and mergers and acquisitions. It relates to what we talked about before, but it's a little more detailed when we talk about what the risk assessment factors we definitely want to look at as part of the process in doing that. Understand the hierarchy of controls, source reduction, source treatment, and disposal. And then climate change, it's a new section. I certainly expect some type of questions dealing with climate change, its impact, what are the risk factors associated with something like that. Chapter 10, crime and cyber risk. Difference between different types of crime and measures that can be taken to deter some of that. So again, when we talk about crime, the four elements that really look at our personnel policies, when we talk about that, it's, what our hiring processes are. Do we, background checks, those type of things, making sure we're hiring the right type of people. Then we have physical controls. What are the barriers? Cameras, various windows, doors, all those type of things, fences, all those are the physical barriers. Procedural controls. those are the internal controls of making sure that when you count a till, you have another person, also there's another person counting at a later time. That you have basically the person that counts the money is also the person taking the money to the bank. You want to make sure that there's some type of internal controls to prevent that, or loss of material, or or in some cases procedural controls. I use like, let's say, oil being changed in a car. So Jiffy Lube, one of the things they do is that they say, okay, at least when I was there, I think they still do this. Someone yells out, was this checked? And they kind of do, after everything's done, they kind of go through all the safety checks to make sure everything was put back, all the caps, those type of things. Because, check the oil. So before I leave, they actually, they show the caps tight. They show that, hey, there's oil in it. Because the worst thing that could happen is you leave and there's no oil, which is, I've known someone that's happened as well. And actually, it was a friend that had their car taken to Walmart and had the oil changed. They forgot to put the oil back in, or they didn't put the cap on the bottom, went all the way through. Excuse me. Almost done. Cyber risk. Know the effects on property, net income, and liability. And then, again, social media is a new section, and I expect some questions probably on the privacy and operational risk issue area. Excuse me. All right, so last chapter. So obviously this should be fresh from last week. So fleet risk. Understand how fleet is a system, which really consists of the components and parts. So you want to make sure you know what, in there talk about what are the components, of that. So what makes the components parts? The environment, the physical, legal, and economic environment. Life cycle. There's the various phases of the life cycle, which is conceptual, all that, all the way to disposal. And that's really important. So you're going to have a question because life cycle, we talked about systems. System safety deals with the same type of life cycle approach. And then also how the systems and relationships are all tied together. On the federal motor carrier safety, there's most likely going to be a scenario-based question. It's going to probably involve like either drug testing and motor vehicle record review. What would be some of the things you'd want to put in place for a new program? How to control losses with operating the fleet. Again, think big picture. I use Southwest as the example in the class, even though it's not really, it's a fleet of aircraft. It's not a fleet of cars, but it's a fleet. And so if, again, you think about when we talked about Southwest, from an efficiency standpoint, it's a very efficient operation. There's thought put into the way they designed their operation. The selection, only one type of aircraft, which reduces, training becomes easier when we talk about drivers, or maintenance becomes easier because you're not having to have all the different things. So the key components when we think about operating fleet, so vehicle selection, vehicle maintenance, drivers, the cargo, routes, and vehicle schedules. And I think if you think of Southwest as kind of the model, again, big picture, it helps you keep in mind. So if you got a question, you go, oh, I don't remember all the different things. You should be able to think, okay, Southwest, okay, well, they only have one type of aircraft. What would be the benefits of doing that? Okay, well, it'll be easy to train people. Probably select, that probably easy to maintain. Issues Southwest, they have certain routes that they take, so that'll be probably part of it. Will they carry? They carry people, and you have cargo. So, anyways, hopefully that becomes helpful in there. And the last part of that was understanding the technology and helping with risk control efforts, and what that should be part of it. So the technology we talked about, drive cam, there's all the backup cameras, there's all those things that are on there that will certainly help. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, so I don't have to re-record this later, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, and I'm going to pull up, if nothing else, the review notes, and we'll go over there, so that way we'll fast track. So I'm just going to pause the recording, and we'll get started in just 1 second, and we'll take questions. It does appear, I remember doing Chapter 7, but since it didn't show up, we'll just go ahead and go over just from the review notes to do it. So Chapter 7 dealt with the management liability, which basically meant responsibilities of the board of directors and directors and officers, so D&O. So on this one, the main areas that I would focus on are really going to be, when we talk about the major responsibilities, it's going to be the duties of care. So this, which really starts on this section. So if you focus on the fiduciary responsibility, directors and officers' fiduciary duties include the duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of disclosure, and duty of obedience. The most important one of those is duty of care. The idea of that to make sure the assets are protected. I mean, it's just a core element of that's what going back to the definition of what duty of care is in the book of doing what a reasonable person would do and all that. But their job is to make sure that protect the assets and not have lawsuits, comply with the law. The duty of loyalty, again, that was doing that had to deal with essentially not stealing clients, that you're going to do things in the best interest, that you're not going to take advantage of that. So actually, so directors and officers have the duty of care, also called the duty of diligence, when performing their contract functions, to consider they've met their duty of care when they meet these standards, act in good faith and in a manner they reasonably believe to be in the corporation's best interest, and discharge their responsibilities with informed judgment and degree of care that a person in a similar position would believe to be reasonable under similar circumstances. And part of how you demonstrate that is making sure that you actually read the things you're signing, that if you're a board member, that you're actually reading the audit report. That's part of it. If you're just going and you're voting on stuff and not reading things, that could be how someone can say that you're not performing the duty of care as part of that. So that's really the main concept. It goes through some of the other elements here, but the duty of care is probably the most important one. It does talk about the different types of suits. Yeah.
How's it different from fiduciary?
Fiduciary?
Yeah.
So fiduciary, I mean, it's part of, so the duty of quick care is actually part of the fiduciary responsibility. So as fiduciary, your job is to really protect, what's in the best interest of the organization. That's really what a fiduciary is. It's looking out for the organization. And as part of those fiduciary responsibilities, it says duty of care is one, duty of obedience. All the duties are part of the fiduciary responsibility that falls in there. So yeah, that's how that's done. It does talk about the different suits that might be filed, the derivative suits and non-derivative. Again, the main thing being a derivative, it's part of the corporation being made as people internal, essentially, on behalf of the corporation. Whereas non-derivative is basically anyone that's outside, and where someone can make a suit against the company for fraudulent filing of returns or something like that, where it causes stock to go down. And really what they're looking at that, whereas non-derivative you can actually get money back, a derivative is really trying to cause a different course of action. There's really no money being changed hands as part of that. And again, class actions would be a large portion of non-derivative suits. A big discussion we did have on this chapter was indemnification of directors and officers. And of course we were talking about all the stuff going on in San Diego, and I think which was good, because when we had that conversation, if you remember, said, oh, negotiations, most likely he's probably negotiating indemnification. So in the event that something happens, that they'll repay his bills, and lo and behold, that's what exactly was being negotiated in closed session. The idea being that the indemnification doesn't prevent the cost from the person incurring the cost, being that if he's found innocent or not guilty, probably a better word, or not being at fault, I guess is really the correct term in this case, that then the city will then pay his legal bills. So he's indemnified from losing any dollars. Now, likelihood of that happening, of course, takes one. It's probably pretty limited, but that is essentially what he was looking for. And the reason, that's what he's looking for to resign, is he wanted that indemnification protection as part of that. Now, that was in the details as far as what that specifically looks like. And then, liability, controlling D&O liability loss exposures. Insurance can transfer some of the financial risk, and we talked about that. So there's that financial piece, but the reputational damage, you can't buy insurance for that, and that's really where it really becomes the most important. The other elements that we talked about on the objectives had to deal with employment practices liability. Now, we talk about EPL, or employment practices. We're really talking about discrimination, wrongful termination type claims. And so when we look at those, so what are those things that we can do to prevent those and be able to describe what a discrimination claim, how someone might be able to file those, and retaliation, whistleblower. So those are some of the things that were discussed as part of that. And you might get some questions on that. More likely you're going to get more of the indemnification and the duty of care. Again, if anything you're going to get questions on this chapter, it's going to be duty of care. How would you protect? What are some of the elements of it? And there will probably be a question of which one of these describes the duty of care. So, or how do you, we said what are the defenses? What are the activities you have to do? And so you might have a choice, and it'll say which one of these describes the duty of care, or something like that. And it'll give definitions of all the other things as part of that. The other one was on ERISA, which is the Employer Retirement Income Security Act, and it gave some very fiduciary duties that it talks about here under B. Loyalty, fiduciary's actions must be solely in the best interest of the plan, prudence, diversification, adherence. Again, most likely you're going to get a question dealing with the ERISA responsibilities. There's other things that are talked about that in the chapter, like with HIPAA and those type of things, but most likely the area is going to be more of the component dealing with the ERISA area will most likely be where the questions are going to be coming from. And so those were the only really two key elements were the objectives of part of Chapter 7. And then ultra buyers, there might, they include as a keyword or phrase. And if you remember correctly, the act of a corporation that exceeds its chartered powers. The idea being, can a corporation really indemnify a director and officer? Because it's not really in the best interest to do that. And so that's where that issue kind of came up in the discussion as part of that. So with that, we've covered pretty much, now we did officially cover all the chapters. What we'll do is if there's any questions, since we covered most of the material, by all means, certainly you can I'll either unmute the line or certainly type those, and we'll go through and see if I can't answer those questions, or if not, you can ask them afterwards, and I'll do my best to respond individually back to folks. So any questions? All right. Well, I don't necessarily see anyone typing, so well, I want to thank everyone for the participating. This 10 weeks obviously went by very quickly since we didn't take any breaks like we did before. When we do 56, there'll be at least 3 to 4 breaks in between there, give a little more people time to make sure they have all the reading material. We also now, so we've got about, a 4-week break in between, or actually maybe 5 weeks between the end of this class now and the next one. So hopefully I encourage you to hopefully take the exam fairly soon. And by all means, I encourage you to give me a call, ask questions. I enjoy doing this, and hopefully be able to help answer some of those questions you may have as you go through the material, and hopefully make it live. So again, thank you for everyone participating, and look forward to hopefully many of you returning for ARN 56.